September 24th, 1942. Berlin. The Wolf's Lair. Hitler's military headquarters. A moment is about to occur that will reveal something fundamental about how organizations fail, about how power corrupts decision-making, about how the suppression of truth leads to catastrophe, about what happens when the person telling the truth is punished for delivering it. Franz Halder stands outside the conference room. General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, one of the most respected military minds in Germany, a man with access to every strategic calculation, a man who understands the Eastern Front better than anyone, a man about to walk into a meeting that will change everything. Halder is nervous. He shouldn't be nervous. He's a general. He's achieved the highest military position below Hitler himself. But he is nervous because he knows what he's about to do. He knows what happens to people who tell Hitler uncomfortable truths. He knows that what he's about to say will not be received well. He knows that his career might end in this room. But Halder also knows something else. He knows the numbers. He knows the casualty rates. He knows the supply lines. He knows the Soviet reinforcements. He knows the capacity of the Luftwaffe. He knows all of the operational realities that make the Stalingrad campaign mathematically impossible. He knows that if he doesn't say something, if he doesn't tell Hitler the truth, the Sixth Army will be destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers will die. A disaster of historic proportions will unfold. So Halder walks into the conference room carrying his briefing materials, carrying his calculations, carrying his evidence, carrying information that Hitler desperately doesn't want to hear. Here's what you need to understand about Hitler's mental state in September 1942. Hitler believed in will. He believed that sufficient commitment and determination could overcome any obstacle. He believed that the German soldier could accomplish anything. He believed that logistics was secondary to conviction. He believed that doubting the mission was defeatism. He believed that anyone questioning his strategy was working against German victory. Halder was about to question that strategy directly. The briefing began with standard military reports, casualty figures, supply calculations, troop dispositions, reports that should have been routine. But in Hitler's presence, nothing was routine. Hitler sat listening, growing increasingly agitated, growing increasingly angry, waiting for someone to tell him what he wanted to hear. Then Halder presented his analysis of the Stalingrad situation. And this is where everything changed. Halder presented data showing that Soviet reinforcements were crossing the Volga River in greater numbers than expected. Halder presented calculations showing that the supply lines were stretched impossibly thin. Halder presented evidence that the Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces on the flanks were inadequate. Halder presented analysis suggesting that the current strategy would lead to encirclement of German forces. Halder presented a conclusion that made Hitler's blood boil, that the Stalingrad campaign needed to be reconsidered, that strategic consolidation was necessary, that victory through willpower alone was not sufficient. This is where real organizational dysfunction becomes apparent, because Halder wasn't being insubordinate. He wasn't being disloyal. He was doing exactly what a chief of staff should do. He was presenting his commander with realistic assessment based on intelligence. He was giving Hitler the information necessary to make informed decisions. He was being a professional military officer, and Hitler hated him for it. Subscribe right now because this story about what happens when truth confronts power deserves to reach millions of people who need to understand organizational dysfunction and its consequences. Hitler's response was immediate. Halder was defeatist. Halder was obsessed with logistics instead of focus on victory. Halder was spreading doubt. Halder was a brake on the army's potential. Halder was everything that was wrong with the officer. Course that couldn't understand that willpower could overcome any obstacle. Halder stood silently listening to this tirade. He knew what was coming. He knew that Hitler was building to a dismissal. He knew that contradicting Hitler was career suicide. He knew that everything he'd worked for was ending in this room. And he was right. Within hours, Franz Halder was removed as chief of staff. Within days, his replacement arrived. Within weeks, Halder was completely separated from military command, all because he told Hitler the truth. Think about that for a moment. The military officer with the best understanding of the Eastern Front, the person with access to all the intelligence, the person whose calculations were accurate, the person whose warnings were justified. This person was punished for telling the truth. What happened next proved Halder was absolutely right. Exactly as Halder predicted, the Sixth Army was encircled at Stalingrad. Exactly as Halder calculated, the Luftwaffe could not deliver the supplies necessary to sustain trapped forces. Exactly. As Halder warned, the flanks proved inadequate to protect the main army. Exactly as Halder anticipated, the campaign became a catastrophe. Over 300,000 German soldiers died at Stalingrad. The flower of the Wehrmacht was destroyed. Soviet forces achieved their greatest victory. The tide of the war turned. And all of this happened exactly as Franz Halder predicted in that meeting in September 1942. The organizational dysfunction that led to this disaster deserves your attention because the same patterns repeat in organizations everywhere. When leaders punish truth-telling, when organizations suppress realistic assessment, when power becomes more important than accuracy, organizations make catastrophic decisions. This is the story of what happens when an organization punishes the person who tells the truth. This is the story of Franz Halder. This is the story of how the suppression of realistic assessment leads to disaster. But before we explore the full implications of Halder's firing, let me give you the complete context of the Stalingrad situation. Because understanding why Halder's warnings were so accurate requires understanding what was actually happening on the ground. The Stalingrad campaign began in August 1942. German forces advanced rapidly initially, but as they pushed deeper into the Soviet Union, their supply lines became increasingly extended. The distances were enormous. The logistics were strained. The Soviets were retreating but not breaking. The Soviets were preparing counteroffensives that German intelligence was missing. Halder's staff had been warning about these problems for months. The casualty rates were unsustainable. The replacements weren't arriving fast enough. The equipment losses couldn't be replaced. The Soviets were rebuilding capabilities faster than Germans were destroying them. The mathematics simply didn't work if the campaign continued as planned. But Hitler wanted Stalingrad. Hitler wanted the victory symbolically. Stalingrad bore Stalin's name. Taking it would be a propaganda triumph. Taking it would demonstrate German superiority. Taking it would demoralize Soviet resistance. Hitler's desire for Stalingrad overrode every rational consideration. Halder tried to present the rational considerations. Halder tried to explain that Stalingrad couldn't be held if the Soviets launched a coordinated counteroffensive from multiple directions. Halder tried to make Hitler understand that the flanks were vulnerable. Halder tried to explain that the supply situation was critical, and Hitler dismissed all of it. Hitler said the will to victory was sufficient. Hitler said that German soldiers could accomplish anything. Hitler said that doubting the mission was defeatism. Hitler said that anyone questioning his strategy was working against German victory. Tell me in the comments, have you ever seen a leader reject accurate information because they didn't want to hear it? Have you ever witnessed an organization ignore warnings because leaders were committed to a particular course? The tragedy of Halder's dismissal is that it served as a lesson to everyone in the German command structure. The lesson was simple. Tell Hitler what he wants to hear or suffer the consequences. Present realistic assessment and you'll be fired. Question the strategy and you're a defeatist. Warn about problems and you're working against victory. That lesson had cascading effects throughout the German military command. Officers learned to soften their reports. Generals learned to present information in ways that supported what Hitler wanted to hear. Intelligence was filtered through the question of whether Hitler would want to know it. Realistic assessment became dangerous. This is organizational dysfunction at its most extreme. But the pattern isn't unique to Nazi Germany. The pattern appears in every organization where power trumps accuracy, every organization where leaders punish truth-telling, every organization where realistic assessment becomes dangerous. The difference between organizations that thrive and organizations that fail often comes down to this simple question. Will your organization listen to accurate information, even when that information contradicts what leadership wants to hear? Will your organization protect people who deliver realistic assessments? Will your organization value truth over convenience? Halder's firing demonstrates what happens when the answer is no. When leaders punish truth-telling, when organizations suppress realistic assessment, when power becomes more important than accuracy, catastrophic decisions result. The immediate aftermath of Halder's dismissal demonstrated this pattern. General Kurt Zeitzler replaced him. Zeitzler initially tried to support Hitler's vision, but Zeitzler quickly realized that the same problems Halder warned about were becoming critical. Zeitzler began offering warnings of his own. Zeitzler began presenting realistic assessment, and Zeitzler too found himself in conflict with Hitler. But Zeitzler had learned from Halder's experience. Zeitzler learned to present information more carefully. Zeitzler learned to phrase warnings in ways that were less confrontational. Zeitzler learned to soften reports to make them more acceptable. Zeitzler learned that direct confrontation with Hitler over strategy was career suicide. This is what organizational dysfunction produces. It doesn't produce compliance with wise leadership. It produces increasingly filtered information. It produces leaders who learn to hide the truth rather than confront it. It produces organizational culture where accurate information is suppressed in favor of information that supports what leadership wants to believe. By the time Stalingrad actually collapsed in January 1943, Hitler had already created an environment where accurate information couldn't reach him. By that time, the officer corps had learned to present only information Hitler wanted to hear. By that time, realistic assessment had become so dangerous that officers kept it private, instead of raising it through official channels. Halder's firing was the signal to the entire German military. Tell the truth and you'll be fired. Support the strategy and you'll be protected. The message was clear. The consequences were swift. The organizational dysfunction was complete, like this video, because this story about organizational dysfunction deserves massive reach and should influence how every organization thinks about truth-telling and realistic assessment. But here's what makes this story even more important. Halder's firing didn't just have military consequences. It had political consequences. It had strategic consequences. It influenced how the entire Nazi regime made decisions. It demonstrated that in Nazi Germany, reality could be overruled by will, that inconvenient truths could be dismissed by decisive leadership, that defeatism could be defined as accurate prediction of failure. This organizational pattern extended far beyond military command. Throughout Nazi Germany, organizations learned that accurate reporting was dangerous. Accurate reporting about the Holocaust was suppressed. Accurate reporting about industrial capacity was filtered. Accurate reporting about civilian morale was hidden. Organizations that should have been providing realistic assessment instead provided information that supported Nazi ideology. This is what happens when organizations punish truth-telling. This is what results when power becomes more important than accuracy. This is the organizational dysfunction that Nazi Germany demonstrated at every level. The Western democracies, by contrast, created organizations that protected truth-telling. Military planners could present realistic assessment without fear of punishment. Intelligence officers could report uncomfortable truths. Scientists could conduct research that contradicted official positions. This protection of truth-telling gave Western organizations tremendous advantages. When the war turned against Germany, when Stalingrad collapsed, when the Soviet counteroffensive swept westward, the German military couldn't adapt, because the information systems that would have enabled adaptation had been destroyed. The German military couldn't recognize the scale of disaster, because accurate information was being suppressed. The German military couldn't make wise decisions because the decision-making process had been corrupted by the punishment of truth-telling. Halder's firing in September 1942 was the moment when German organizational dysfunction became complete, the moment when realistic assessment became impossible, the moment when accurate information could no longer reach decision-makers, the moment when the organization sealed its own fate. This is the organizational lesson of Halder's dismissal. This is why this story matters. This is what every organization should learn from what happened in Nazi Germany. Subscribe, because understanding how organizational dysfunction emerges and how it leads to catastrophic failures is essential for leaders seeking to build organizations that avoid these patterns. Now let me tell you what happened to Halder after his dismissal, because the story doesn't end with his removal from command. Because Halder's experience reveals something else important about organizational dysfunction. Halder went into enforced retirement. He was removed from position but kept alive because he was valuable enough that executing him would cause too much disruption. Instead, he was isolated. His advice was no longer sought. His predictions were no longer considered. His warnings were no longer heard. For months, Halder watched his predictions come true. He watched the Sixth Army get encircled exactly as he predicted. He watched the supply situation become critical exactly as he calculated. He watched the disaster unfold exactly as he warned, and he was powerless to do anything about it. He was removed from command because he told the truth. Now he had to watch the consequences of nobody believing him. This is a particular kind of torture for someone like Halder. Someone who understood the stakes. Someone who could see the disaster unfolding. Someone who had tried to warn and been punished for it. Someone who had to live with the knowledge that the catastrophe could have been prevented if his warnings had been heeded. Halder's experience demonstrates something else about organizations that punish truth-telling. They don't just make bad decisions. They lose the valuable people who could help them recover. They exile the experts who could help them adapt. They isolate themselves from the people most capable of helping them recognize and respond to changing conditions. By removing Halder, Hitler didn't just lose accurate information. Hitler lost access to the military mind most capable of understanding the Eastern Front. Hitler lost the officer most capable of responding to the Soviet counteroffensive. Hitler lost the strategist most capable of developing alternative strategies when the original strategy failed. This is what organizations that punish truth-telling inevitably do. They lose their best people. They isolate their most capable leaders. They exile their greatest thinkers. They ensure that when crisis comes, they don't have access to the people most capable of helping them. Later in the war, Halder was imprisoned. After the July 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler, Halder was arrested because he was associated with the plot. Halder spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. He survived the war, but spent the final 18 months imprisoned by the organization that had already exiled him once. This is the ultimate consequence of organizational dysfunction. It doesn't just fail, it destroys itself. It doesn't just make bad decisions. It ensures that when recovery becomes possible, it has exiled the people capable of enabling that recovery. Tag someone in the comments who needs to understand that organizations punishing truth-telling guarantee their own failure and the loss of their best people. But let me go back to the original question. Why did Halder's predictions prove so accurate? What did Halder understand that Hitler refused to understand? What made Halder's assessment correct and Hitler's belief in victory through willpower wrong? Halder understood numbers. Halder understood logistics. Halder understood military mathematics. Halder understood that warfare wasn't about will. Warfare was about resources. Warfare was about supply lines. Warfare was about the ratio of forces. Warfare was about the mathematics of combat. Hitler believed in will. Hitler believed that conviction could overcome any obstacle. Hitler believed that German soldiers were superior. Hitler believed that the Soviets were inferior and would break. Hitler believed that the will to victory was sufficient to achieve victory regardless of logistics or mathematical ratios. These two worldviews were fundamentally incompatible, and when they collided, Halder's worldview proved correct. The mathematics were correct. The supply lines did matter. The logistics did matter. The ratio of forces did matter. The will to victory was insufficient to overcome mathematical reality. This is the lesson that extends far beyond World War II. This is the lesson that applies to every organization. Mathematics matter. Reality matters. Accurate assessment matters. Will alone is insufficient to overcome mathematical reality. Conviction alone can't change logistics. Belief alone can't overcome supply chain challenges. Organizations that understand this thrive. Organizations that ignore this fail. Organizations that listen to people like Halder who understand the mathematics succeed. Organizations that punish people like Halder for presenting mathematical reality fail. The question becomes what kind of organization you're building. Are you building an organization that listens to mathematical reality? Are you building an organization that values accurate assessment? Are you building an organization that protects people who present inconvenient truths? Or are you building an organization like Nazi Germany that punishes truth-telling and ensures organizational failure? Share this story because every organization faces this choice, and most organizations don't realize the stakes until they've already made the wrong choice. Now let me tell you what Halder's dismissal meant for the rest of the German officer corps, because the signal sent by removing the chief of staff for telling the truth rippled throughout the military. Every general understood the message. Every officer understood what happened to people who contradicted Hitler. Every military planner understood that realistic assessment was dangerous. Every strategist understood that presenting information Hitler didn't want to hear could end their career. What resulted was systematic filtering of information. What resulted was officers learning to present only information that supported Hitler's strategy. What resulted was intelligence being interpreted to support conclusions Hitler had already reached. What resulted was military decision-making being corrupted by the need to tell the leader what he wanted to hear instead of telling him what he needed to know. This pattern appeared throughout Nazi Germany and throughout every organization where leaders punish truth-telling. Personnel begin filtering information, reports become less accurate, intelligence becomes corrupted by the need to support leadership conclusions, decision-making becomes based on false information, and organizations that make decisions based on false information fail. They fail strategically. They fail operationally. They fail competitively. They fail because they've corrupted the information systems that enable good decision-making. German military command in the latter years of World War II is a perfect case study in organizational failure caused by information corruption. Commanders didn't get accurate reports about troop strength because reporting bad news about losses was dangerous. Officers didn't report realistic assessments of capability because presenting limitations was career suicide. Intelligence officers didn't report information that contradicted what Hitler believed because that information would be rejected and the officers would be punished. By 1944, the German military was making strategic decisions based on systematically corrupted information. By 1945, German military command had become almost completely disconnected from military reality. By the end of the war, German leaders were giving orders to units that no longer existed based on information that bore no relationship to ground truth. This is what happens when organizations punish truth-telling. This is what results when power becomes more important than accuracy. This is the organizational dysfunction that leads to catastrophic failure. Like this video because understanding how information corruption leads to organizational failure is essential for every leader seeking to avoid these patterns. Now I want to explain something absolutely crucial about what Halder understood that Hitler refused to understand. Because the nature of their disagreement reveals something fundamental about organizational decision-making. Halder was a staff officer. Staff officers exist to present commanders with realistic assessment. Staff officers exist to warn commanders about risks. Staff officers exist to present mathematical analysis of what's actually possible. That's the fundamental role of military staff. Hitler was a political leader who had become a military commander. Hitler had political instincts. Hitler had propaganda skills. Hitler had the ability to inspire people to follow him. But Hitler had no training in military logistics. Hitler had no understanding of supply chain mathematics. Hitler had no experience with military staff analysis. When Hitler took personal command of military operations, when Hitler decided to override his military staff, when Hitler chose will over logistics, he was operating outside his area of expertise. But because he held political power, nobody could stop him. This is the organizational dysfunction that many organizations replicate. Organizations where people move into positions based on political skill rather than subject matter expertise. Organizations where those with political power override those with technical expertise. Organizations where power matters more than knowledge. Halder tried to present Hitler with technical expertise. Halder tried to explain supply chain mathematics. Halder tried to present logistical reality. Halder tried to give Hitler the information he needed to make informed decisions about military operations. And Hitler dismissed all of it because Hitler had political power, and Halder didn't. Because Hitler had conviction, and Halder had calculations. Because Hitler believed in will, and Halder believed in numbers. The result was that military decisions were made by someone without military expertise based on political instinct, rather than technical knowledge. The result was catastrophe. The result was exactly what Halder predicted. This pattern appears in organizations everywhere. Organizations where the person with the most power has the least expertise. Organizations where political skill trumps technical knowledge. Organizations where conviction overrides calculation. These organizations make terrible decisions. These organizations fail. Halder's dismissal was the moment when German military command made the choice to put political power above technical expertise. That choice had consequences that rippled through the entire organization. That choice corrupted information systems. That choice led to catastrophic decisions. That choice ensured organizational failure. Your organization faces the same choice. Will you put technical expertise above political power? Will you listen to people who understand the technical realities? Will you protect people like Halder, who present mathematical reality? Or will you follow the pattern of Nazi Germany and ensure organizational failure by punishing truth-telling? Make absolutely sure you understand this because the choice you make determines whether your organization thrives or fails. Comment below with your take on this story. Have you seen organizations that punish truth-telling? Have you witnessed what happens when technical expertise gets overridden by political power? Have you experienced the consequences of information corruption? Share your stories because they matter. This is the story of Franz Halder. This is the story of what happens when organizations punish the person who tells the truth. This is the story of organizational dysfunction at its most extreme. This is the story that every leader should understand. Thank you for learning this story. Thank you for understanding why this matters. Thank you for recognizing that organizations protecting truth-telling thrive, while organizations punishing truth-telling fail. Now share this story. Tell others about Franz Halder. Tell them what happened when Nazi Germany fired its best general for being right. Tell them about the organizational dysfunction that results from punishing truth-telling. Tell them that their organization should make different choices. Like this. Video, subscribe, comment, share, because this story deserves massive reach and should influence how every organization thinks about truth-telling, realistic assessment, and the protection of people who deliver inconvenient truths. This is the complete story of September 24th, 1942. The day Germany fired its best general for being right. The day organizational dysfunction became complete. The day the organization sealed its own fate by punishing the person who told the truth. Remember this story. Learn from it. Make sure your organization never makes the same mistakes. Let me take you deeper into what Halder actually understood about the Stalingrad situation that Hitler refused to comprehend. Because understanding the technical details explains why Halder's dismissal was so tragic and why his warnings were so accurate. The German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus had pushed into Stalingrad in August 1942. Initially, the Germans made rapid progress. The Soviets seemed to be collapsing. The victory seemed imminent, but Halder's staff was analyzing something that Hitler refused to acknowledge. The Soviet forces weren't broken. The Soviet forces were being supplied across the Volga by boat. The Soviets were bringing reinforcements into the city, while German forces fought street by street to capture it. Halder understood something crucial that Hitler refused to accept. Stalingrad was not a city to be conquered. Stalingrad was a trap. The longer German forces remained committed to capturing the city, the longer German supply lines were stretched. The longer German forces fought in an urban environment, where their numerical advantage meant nothing. The longer the Sixth Army remained committed to Stalingrad, the more vulnerable the flanks became. On those vulnerable flanks, exactly where Halder warned about problems, stood Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces, Allied forces that were far less capable than German forces, Allied forces that were inadequately equipped, Allied forces that were not in position to defend against a determined Soviet offensive, Allied forces that would break under pressure. Halder's calculations showed that if the Soviets launched a coordinated offensive from north and south, if Soviet forces attacked the flanks that were held by Allied troops, if Soviet forces drove westward behind the Sixth Army, the Germans would be encircled. The Sixth Army would be surrounded. The supply situation would become critical. The Sixth Army would be destroyed. This wasn't theoretical analysis. This was based on intelligence. This was based on troop dispositions. This was based on Soviet capabilities. This was based on Soviet intentions that German intelligence was observing. Halder was presenting mathematical reality. Halder was presenting what the numbers actually showed. Halder was presenting what military science actually indicated would happen. Hitler refused to believe it. Hitler believed that the Sixth Army was invincible. Hitler believed that Soviet forces would break before German willpower. Hitler believed that the operation would achieve total victory. Hitler believed that Halder was wrong and that only willpower could prove him right. Guess what happened? Exactly what Halder predicted. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus. Soviet forces attacked the Romanian flank from north of Stalingrad. Soviet forces attacked the Hungarian flank from south of Stalingrad. Soviet forces drove westward. Soviet forces completed an encirclement. The Sixth Army was surrounded. Halder's prediction had proven absolutely correct. The supply situation became critical, exactly as Halder calculated. The Luftwaffe was supposed to deliver 600 to 700 tons of supplies daily to sustain the surrounded Sixth Army. The Luftwaffe delivered maybe 100 tons per day on average, sometimes far less. The Sixth Army was starving. The Sixth Army was running out of ammunition. The Sixth Army was dying. The relief force that Hitler promised never materialized. The breakthrough that Hitler promised never happened. The rescue that Hitler assured would come never arrived. And the Sixth Army, exactly as Halder predicted, was destroyed. 280,000 German soldiers surrendered at Stalingrad. Fewer than 10,000 survived captivity. The cream of the German army was gone, and Halder, the man who had predicted this disaster, was not there to see it. He was in enforced retirement, having been fired for telling the truth. Subscribe. Because understanding how accurate predictions get dismissed and how organizations ignore warnings deserves to reach everyone leading organizations. This is the tragic element of Halder's story. Halder was right. Halder's calculations were correct. Halder's predictions came true with remarkable accuracy. But Halder wasn't believed because Halder's truth contradicted what Hitler wanted to believe. This pattern of organizations dismissing accurate warnings and suffering the predicted consequences is depressingly common. Organizations ignore risk assessments. Organizations dismiss financial warnings. Organizations disregard technical limitations. Organizations suppress realistic assessment of market conditions. And when the predicted disaster occurs, the organizations that ignored the warnings suffer the consequences. The difference between organizations that thrive and organizations that fail is often just this simple factor. Do they listen to accurate warnings from people who understand the situation? Do they believe technical expertise? Do they act on realistic assessment? Or do they dismiss warnings and proceed with confidence based on belief rather than calculation? Halder's case is just an extreme historical example. But the principle applies universally. Organizations that listen to people like Halder thrive. Organizations that fire people like Halder fail. The question becomes what kind of organization you're leading. Are you the kind of leader who listens to accurate warnings? Are you the kind of leader who protects people delivering realistic assessment? Are you the kind of leader who values technical expertise? Or are you the kind of leader who fires people for telling uncomfortable truths? Your answer to these questions determines your organization's future. Your answer determines whether your organization will anticipate problems or be blindsided by them. Your answer determines whether your organization will thrive or fail when challenges emerge. Think about your own organization. Right now, is there a Halder working for you? Is there someone with accurate information about problems? Is there someone warning about risks? Is there someone presenting realistic assessment? And more importantly, are you listening to them? Or are you dismissing them as you move forward based on conviction and hope? If you're dismissing them, your organization is following the pattern of Nazi Germany. If you're listening to them, your organization is taking steps to avoid catastrophe. The choice is yours. But the historical evidence is clear. Organizations that listen to people like Halder survive. Organizations that fire them fail. Make absolutely sure you're making the right choice. Because the consequences are enormous. Because the difference between thriving and failing often comes down to this single factor. Because organizations that protect truth-telling outperform those that punish it. Now let me explain something about the actual mechanics of the encirclement and how completely Halder's predictions were validated. Because understanding the tactical details shows just how precisely Halder understood what was going to happen. Halder predicted encirclement from flanks held by Allied troops. That's exactly what happened. Soviet forces attacked the Romanian Third Army and the Hungarian Second Army. Halder had specifically warned that these forces couldn't hold against a coordinated Soviet assault. These forces broke. Soviet forces swept through them. Soviet forces drove westward. German and Romanian forces were encircled. Halder's prediction was validated tactically. Halder predicted the supply situation would become critical. Halder calculated that the Luftwaffe couldn't deliver sufficient supplies. That's exactly what happened. The airlift failed. The Sixth Army starved. The Sixth Army ran out of ammunition. The Sixth Army was eventually destroyed by starvation and Soviet attack. Halder's calculation was validated logistically. Halder predicted that the relief force would fail. Halder understood that the remaining forces weren't sufficient to break the encirclement. That's exactly what happened. Relief efforts were beaten back. The Sixth Army couldn't break out. The Sixth Army couldn't be rescued. The Sixth Army was destroyed. Halder's strategic prediction was validated operationally. Halder predicted that Soviet strategy anticipated the German Stalingrad operation and had prepared counteroffensives. That's exactly what happened. Soviet forces were positioned to launch their encirclement. Soviet forces had been reinforced for the counteroffensive. Soviet planning had anticipated German strategy. Halder's understanding of Soviet strategy was validated by Soviet actions. Every single one of Halder's predictions came true with remarkable accuracy. This wasn't lucky guessing. This wasn't theoretical analysis that happened to be right. This was deep understanding of military mathematics, logistics, strategy, and capability. This was the product of years of military experience. This was the analysis of someone who understood warfare at the deepest levels. And because Halder understood these things, he tried to warn Hitler. And because Halder warned Hitler, Halder was fired. Like and share this video because every leader needs to understand the tragic consequences of firing the person who tells you the truth. Now I want to explain what happened in the German military command structure after Halder's dismissal, because understanding the aftermath shows how organizational dysfunction cascades through the entire organization when truth-telling is punished. Zeitzler replaced Halder as chief of II staff. Zeitzler was younger. Zeitzler was more ambitious. Zeitzler was more willing to work within Hitler's framework. Initially, Zeitzler supported the Stalingrad operation. Initially, Zeitzler presented information in ways that supported Hitler's strategy. Initially, Zeitzler seemed like exactly what Hitler wanted. But Zeitzler, like Halder, was a competent military officer. Zeitzler, like Halder, understood military mathematics. Zeitzler, like Halder, could read intelligence reports and understand what they meant. Zeitzler, like Halder, began to understand that the Stalingrad operation was becoming problematic. Zeitzler, like Halder, began to see the encirclement forming. And Zeitzler, having learned from Halder's example, began to present warnings in carefully coded language. Zeitzler stopped calling it a disaster waiting to happen. Zeitzler started calling it a situation requiring attention. Zeitzler stopped saying the Sixth Army would be destroyed. Zeitzler started saying the Sixth Army should consider consolidation. Zeitzler learned to deliver bad news in ways that Hitler might accept. This is what organizational dysfunction produces. It doesn't produce silence. It produces filtered communication. It doesn't produce honesty. It produces carefully managed information. It doesn't produce clear warnings. It produces coded language that might slip past the leader's defenses while technically conveying the truth. By the time Stalingrad actually collapsed, by the time the Sixth Army was actually encircled, by the time reality caught up with Hitler's predictions, the military command structure was communicating in this carefully filtered way. Important information was being hidden or coded. Clear warnings were being delivered in subtle language. The organization had developed an entire shadow communication system to convey information Hitler didn't want to hear. This is what happens in organizations where truth-telling is punished. This is what develops in environments where leaders punish people for delivering accurate information. This is the organizational dysfunction that cascades through the entire organization when the top leader makes it clear that truth is dangerous. The filtered communication didn't make the organization better. The filtered communication didn't help Hitler make better decisions. The filtered communication just delayed the moment when Hitler would confront the full reality of the Stalingrad disaster. The filtered communication meant that by the time full reality became undeniable, it was too late to do anything about it. The Sixth Army was already destroyed. This is the tragedy of Halder's dismissal. His dismissal didn't just end one officer's career. His dismissal created a cascade of organizational dysfunction that corrupted the entire military command structure. His dismissal taught every officer in the German military that truth-telling was dangerous. His dismissal created an organizational culture where information was corrupted by the need to tell leaders what they wanted to hear. By 1945, the German military command was almost completely disconnected from reality. Senior commanders were giving orders based on filtered information. Military strategy was being based on systematically corrupted intelligence. The entire military command structure had become dysfunctional because one man had been fired for telling the truth. This cascade of organizational dysfunction is the real tragedy of Halder's dismissal. It's not just that Halder was fired. It's that his firing created patterns that corrupted the entire organization. It's that punishing truth-telling caused organizational dysfunction at every level. It's that one decision to suppress truth led to systematic information corruption. Tag someone in the comments who works in an organization with information corruption. Tell them this story. Tell them what happens when truth-telling is punished. Tell them that their organization needs to change. Now let me tell you what lessons the post-war military learned from this disaster. Because understanding how militaries changed after World War II shows how important this lesson became. After the war, every military examined what went wrong in Nazi Germany. Every military studied how Hitler's organization made catastrophic decisions. Every military recognized that information corruption had been central to Nazi Germany's failure. Every military made changes to ensure that their organizations wouldn't replicate Nazi Germany's mistakes. Modern militaries developed formal procedures for presenting realistic assessment to commanders. Modern militaries created inspector general positions to protect truth-telling. Modern militaries developed alternative channels for presenting information that contradicted official narratives. Modern militaries made it clear that delivering accurate information was protected and that punishment for truth-telling was prohibited. These changes weren't made for idealistic reasons. These changes were made because military leaders understood that information corruption led to military failure. Military leaders understood that suppressing truth-telling caused organizations to make catastrophic decisions. Military leaders understood that protecting truth-telling created organizations that could adapt to changing circumstances. The result is that modern militaries have information systems that are far more resistant to corruption than Nazi Germany's were. Modern militaries have mechanisms for delivering warnings to commanders, even when those warnings contradict official positions. Modern militaries have created cultures where realistic assessment is protected rather than punished. This doesn't mean modern militaries always make perfect decisions, but it means modern militaries are far less likely to make the kind of catastrophic decisions that Nazi Germany made. It means modern militaries are more likely to adapt when circumstances change. It means modern militaries have learned the lesson that Halder's dismissal should have taught everyone. Your organization should learn the same lesson. Your organization should create mechanisms for delivering warnings to leadership, even when those warnings contradict official positions. Your organization should create cultures where realistic assessment is protected rather than punished. Your organization should protect people like Halder, who deliver inconvenient truths. When you do these things, your organization becomes more adaptive. Your organization becomes more capable of responding to changing circumstances. Your organization becomes less likely to make catastrophic decisions based on filtered information. Your organization becomes more effective. This is what the post-war military learned from Nazi Germany. This is what every organization should learn from the story of Franz Halder. Share this story because understanding this lesson is essential for every leader seeking to build organizations that thrive rather than fail. Now I want to take you from military history into modern business because the lessons of Halder's dismissal apply directly to organizations operating in competitive environments today. Because understanding information corruption, the military context helps you recognize information corruption in your business. Many modern corporations have replicated the same organizational dysfunction that destroyed Nazi Germany's military effectiveness. Many corporations suppress warnings about financial problems. Many corporations filter information that contradicts leadership's strategic vision. Many corporations punish employees who deliver realistic assessment of market conditions. Many corporations reward people who tell them what they want to hear and punish people who tell them what they need to know. The result is the same. Organizations that suppress truth-telling make catastrophic decisions. Organizations that filter information become disconnected from market reality. Organizations that punish truth-telling lose access to valuable information. Organizations that dismiss warnings suffer the consequences when those warnings prove accurate. History is full of examples. Corporations that ignored warnings about market changes and were disrupted. Corporations that suppressed information about product defects and suffered lawsuits. Corporations that filtered financial information and went bankrupt. Corporations that punished whistleblowers and experienced catastrophic failures. These aren't just historical curiosities. These are current problems. Right now, organizations are making decisions based on filtered information. Right now, leaders are suppressing warnings from people who understand market reality. Right now, corporations are punishing people who deliver inconvenient truths. Right now, organizations are replicating the organizational dysfunction that destroyed Nazi Germany. The question becomes whether you're aware of these patterns in your own organization. Are you the kind of leader who creates cultures where truth-telling is protected? Or are you the kind of leader who punishes people for delivering warnings? Are you building an organization that learns from Halder's story? Or are you building an organization that replicates Nazi Germany's mistakes? The evidence is clear. Organizations that protect truth-telling outperform those that don't. Organizations that listen to realistic assessment make better decisions. Organizations that reward people for delivering inconvenient truths gain competitive advantages. Organizations that suppress truth-telling lose access to crucial information and make catastrophic decisions. This is not theory. This is empirical reality. This is measurable in corporate performance. This is demonstrable in competitive success. Organizations that protect truth-telling win. Organizations that punish truth-telling lose. Subscribe. Because understanding this competitive advantage is essential for every business leader seeking to outperform competitors. Let me be specific about the mechanisms through which truth-telling creates competitive advantage. Because understanding the specific mechanisms helps you implement them in your organization. First, organizations that protect truth-telling get earlier warnings about problems. When employees know that delivering bad news won't get them punished, when employees understand that realistic assessment is valued, when employees have confidence that warning about problems will be received positively, employees deliver warnings earlier. Earlier warnings give organizations more time to respond. More time to respond means better responses. Better responses mean smaller problems before they become catastrophic. Organizations that punish truth-telling get warnings too late, or not at all. When employees know that delivering bad news gets them fired. When employees understand that realistic assessment is punished. When employees have learned that warning about problems gets them blamed for those problems, employees stay silent. Staying silent means problems don't get addressed until they become catastrophic. Catastrophic problems are harder to solve than emerging problems. Organizations that don't get warnings until problems are catastrophic often can't solve them in time. Second, organizations that protect truth-telling have access to better information for decision-making. When leaders create cultures where realistic assessment is protected, when leaders reward people for delivering accurate information, when leaders actively seek out perspectives that challenge their assumptions, leaders have access to better information. Better information leads to better decisions. Better decisions lead to better outcomes. Organizations that punish truth-telling have access only to information that supports what leaders want to believe. When leaders punish people who contradict their assumptions, when leaders reward people who tell them what they want to hear, leaders lose access to perspectives that might change their minds. Limited information leads to flawed decisions. Flawed decisions lead to poor outcomes. Third, organizations that protect truth-telling retain their best people. Organizations that value accurate assessment, that protect people delivering warnings, that recognize the importance of realistic information, these organizations retain people like Halder. Organizations like this keep their most capable strategists, their most insightful analysts, their most valuable contributors. These people become permanent advantages for organizations that protect them. Organizations that punish truth-telling lose their best people. The people most likely to deliver warnings. The people most likely to challenge assumptions. The people most likely to offer inconvenient truths. These are often the people most capable of helping the organization succeed. When these people are punished, they leave. They take their valuable capabilities to competitors. They share their insights with organizations that will value them. Organizations that punish truth-telling lose access to their most valuable people. Fourth, organizations that protect truth-telling develop cultures of continuous improvement. When employees know that identifying problems is valued, when employees understand that suggesting improvements is protected, when employees believe that pointing out flaws will be received positively, employees continuously identify ways to improve. Continuous improvement leads to continuous competitive advantage. Organizations with cultures of continuous improvement outperform competitors that don't have these cultures. Organizations that punish truth-telling develop cultures of fear and compliance. When employees know that identifying problems gets them blamed, when employees understand that suggesting improvements is seen as criticism, when employees believe that pointing out flaws will get them fired, employees stop identifying problems. They stop suggesting improvements. They focus on compliance and safety. Cultures of compliance don't drive innovation. Cultures of compliance don't create continuous improvement. Cultures of compliance lose to competitors with cultures of continuous improvement. These mechanisms are the ways through which protecting truth-telling creates competitive advantage. These mechanisms are how organizations that listen to people like Halder outperform organizations that fire them. These mechanisms are specific, measurable, and demonstrable. The question becomes whether you're implementing these mechanisms in your organization. Are you creating cultures where realistic assessment is protected? Are you rewarding people who deliver inconvenient truths? Are you retaining your best people or losing them to competitors? Are you developing cultures of continuous improvement or cultures of compliance? Your answers determine your competitive success. Your answers determine whether your organization thrives or fails in the long term. Your answers determine whether you're building organizations like the best modern militaries or like Nazi Germany, like this video, because these competitive advantages of truth-telling deserve massive reach and should influence how every business leader thinks about organizational culture. Now I want to explain something important about why leaders punish truth-telling even though it's obviously harmful to organizational performance, because understanding the psychology of this dysfunction helps you recognize it in yourself and change it. Leaders often punish truth-telling because leaders feel threatened by inconvenient truths. Leaders have made decisions. Leaders have committed to strategies. Leaders have publicly announced plans. When someone presents information that contradicts those decisions, when someone offers analysis suggesting the strategy is flawed, When someone points out that the plan won't work, the leader feels personally attacked. The leader responds by attacking the messenger. The leader responds by punishing the person delivering the inconvenient truth. The leader responds as if the problem is that the truth is being spoken, rather than recognizing that the problem is that the strategy is flawed. Hitler felt this way about Halder. Hitler had committed to Stalingrad. Hitler had publicly announced that Stalingrad would be captured. Hitler had built his entire strategy around the Stalingrad objective. When Halder presented information suggesting that Stalingrad couldn't be held, when Halder offered analysis suggesting that the strategy would fail, Hitler felt personally attacked. Hitler responded by firing Halder. This is a very human reaction. This is a very common reaction. This is a reaction that appears in leaders at every level in every organization. Leaders feel threatened by information that contradicts their decisions. Leaders punish people delivering that information. Leaders attack the messenger to distract from the message. The problem is that this very human reaction creates organizational dysfunction. By firing Halder, Hitler didn't prove that Stalingrad would succeed. By firing Halder, Hitler just ensured that nobody else would warn him about problems. By firing Halder, Hitler created an organizational culture where truth-telling was dangerous. The same thing happens in modern organizations. Leaders feel threatened by warnings about market changes. Leaders attack the people delivering those warnings. Leaders create organizational cultures where warning about problems is dangerous. The result is that the organization loses access to valuable information. The result is that the organization makes decisions based on incomplete or false information. The result is that the organization suffers when the predicted problems materialize. The key to building organizations that avoid this dysfunction is for leaders to recognize this pattern in themselves. Leaders need to recognize that feeling threatened by inconvenient truths is normal and human. Leaders need to recognize that attacking the messenger is a natural but destructive response. Leaders need to develop the discipline to accept inconvenient truths without attacking the people delivering them. This is hard. This requires emotional maturity. This requires the ability to separate your ego from your decisions. This requires the humility to accept that you might be wrong. This requires the strength to change course even after you've publicly committed to a strategy. But this is exactly the discipline that separates leaders who build effective organizations from leaders who build dysfunctional organizations. Leaders who can accept inconvenient truths without attacking the messenger build organizations that thrive. Leaders who attack the messenger build organizations that fail. Halder's story is the ultimate warning about the cost of leaders who attack the messenger. Halder's story shows what happens when leaders punish truth-telling. Halder's story demonstrates that organizations that attack the messenger pay enormous costs. The question becomes whether you're going to learn this lesson or whether you're going to replicate this pattern. Are you going to listen to inconvenient truths? Are you going to protect people delivering realistic assessment? Are you going to build organizations that thrive? Or are you going to attack the messenger and build organizations that fail? Make absolutely sure you're making the right choice, because the consequences are enormous. Because this single choice determines whether your organization succeeds or fails. Because Halder's story shows exactly what happens when leaders make the wrong choice. Tag yourself if you've ever felt threatened by inconvenient truths. Tell yourself that you're going to respond differently. Tell yourself that you're going to listen to warnings instead of attacking the messenger. Tell yourself that you're going to build organizations where truth-telling is protected. Now let me give you specific recommendations for how to protect truth-telling in your organization. Because understanding the problem is important, but fixing the problem is what actually matters. First, create formal mechanisms for delivering bad news to leadership without fear of punishment. Create channels where employees can present warnings that contradict official strategy. Create inspector general roles or ombudsman positions where employees can report problems to someone outside the chain of command. Create processes where warnings reach leadership even if middle management doesn't want them to. Second, explicitly protect people who deliver realistic assessment. Make it clear in writing that delivering accurate information is protected. Make it clear that realistic warnings are valued. Make it clear that there will be no punishment for truth-telling, even if the truth contradicts leadership's strategy. Put these protections in your formal policies. Make them part of your organizational culture. Third, reward people who deliver inconvenient truths. When someone comes to you with a warning, when someone presents information that challenges your assumptions, when someone suggests that your strategy might be flawed, respond positively. Respond with curiosity instead of defensiveness. Respond with gratitude instead of anger. Respond by investigating the concern instead of dismissing it. Make it clear that delivering inconvenient truths is valued. Fourth, change your strategy when evidence demands it. When your people present warnings, when your people suggest that current strategy won't work, when your people offer evidence that you need to change course, actually consider changing course. Don't just pretend to listen while you maintain your original strategy. Actually be willing to change. Actually be willing to admit that you were wrong. Actually be willing to implement better strategies when they're presented to you. Fifth, protect people from retaliation when their warnings prove accurate. If someone warned about a problem and that problem materialized, reward that person for having provided accurate warning. Don't blame the person for the problem. Recognize that the person helped the organization by providing early warning. Don't shoot the messenger. Thank the messenger for giving you time to respond. These are the specific mechanisms that protect truth-telling in organizations. These are the mechanisms that create cultures where reality-based assessment is protected. These are the mechanisms that separate organizations like modern effective militaries from organizations like Nazi Germany. Implement these mechanisms, and your organization becomes more adaptive. Implement these mechanisms, and your organization becomes more competitive. Implement these mechanisms, and your organization becomes more effective. Implement these mechanisms, and your organization protects itself against the kind of catastrophic failure that destroyed Nazi Germany. Share this specific guidance because every organization leader needs these recommendations to transform their organizational culture. I want to tell you something about the personal cost of being Franz Halder. The personal cost of telling the truth. The personal cost of standing alone against organizational power. Because understanding what Halder endured helps explain why organizations punish truth-telling so heavily. Halder wasn't just fired. Halder was humiliated. Halder was publicly called a defeatist. Halder was criticized for lack of faith in German victory. Halder was removed from position in a way that sent a message to every officer in the German military. This is what happens to people who question the leader's strategy. Halder watched his predictions come true. He watched the Sixth Army get encircled exactly as he predicted. He watched the supply situation become critical exactly as he calculated. He watched the disaster unfold exactly as he warned, but he wasn't there to help. He wasn't there to manage the response. He was in retirement watching a catastrophe he had predicted, but couldn't prevent. Later in the war, Halder was arrested because of his association with the July 1944 assassination plot against Hitler. Halder was imprisoned. Halder was interrogated. Halder spent the final months of the war as a prisoner of the organization he had tried to help. After the war, Halder survived. He lived to see the end of Nazi Germany. He lived to see the complete vindication of his warnings. He lived to see history prove him right. But he couldn't get those years back. He couldn't undo the dismissal. He couldn't undo the imprisonment. He couldn't undo the personal cost of having told the truth. This is the real human cost of organizational dysfunction. This is what happens to people like Halder who tell the truth. They suffer. They endure punishment. They watch their predictions come true while being powerless to do anything about it. They spend years imprisoned or isolated because they had the courage to speak truth. This is why understanding Halder's story matters, not just as history, but as a reminder of the real human cost when organizations punish truth-telling. This is why you need to protect people like Halder in your organization, because you're not just protecting them for organizational efficiency, You're protecting them from real human suffering. You're protecting them from the kind of fate that Halder endured. Like this video, because the human cost of organizational dysfunction deserves recognition and should influence how leaders treat people who deliver inconvenient truths. Now let me tell you why this story matters right now in your organization. Why the lessons of Halder's dismissal are relevant today. Why this story deserves to change how you lead. Your organization is probably facing challenges that require accurate information to respond effectively. Your organization is probably dealing with market changes that require understanding of what's actually happening. Your organization is probably facing competitive pressures that require realistic assessment of your position. Right now, in your organization, there are people like Halder. People who understand the actual situation. People who could provide warnings about problems. People who could offer realistic assessment. People who could help your organization respond effectively to challenges. The question is whether your organization is listening to these people or punishing them. If your organization is listening, your organization will respond effectively to challenges. Your organization will adapt to market changes. Your organization will maintain competitive advantage. If your organization is punishing people like Halder, your organization will miss crucial warnings. Your organization will be blindsided by changes. Your organization will lose competitive advantage. The choice you make right now, the choice about how you treat people delivering inconvenient truths, this choice will determine whether your organization thrives or fails. This choice will determine whether your organization is like effective modern militaries or like Nazi Germany. This choice will determine your organization's future. Make the right choice. Listen to people like Halder. Protect people delivering realistic assessment. Create organizational cultures where truth-telling is valued. Build organizations that thrive. Comment below with your commitment to changing how your organization treats truth-telling. Tell the world that you're going to protect people like Halder. Tell others that you're going to build organizations where realistic assessment is valued. Make the commitment public. Hold yourself accountable to that commitment. This is the ultimate lesson of Franz Halder's dismissal. This is what September 24th, 1942 should teach every leader. This is the choice every organization leader must make. The story is complete. The message is clear. The choice is yours. Now go implement what you've learned. Go protect truth-telling in your organization. Go listen to people delivering inconvenient truths. Go build organizations where reality matters more than winning arguments with people who deliver bad news. Go be a leader who learns from Halder's story. Go be a leader who understands that organizational effectiveness depends on protecting truth-telling. Go be a leader who recognizes that the people delivering warnings might be the most valuable people in your organization. This is the complete story of September 24th, 1942. The day Germany fired its best general for telling the truth. The day organizational dysfunction became complete. The day the organization sealed its own fate. Remember this story. Learn from it. Make sure your organization never makes the same mistakes. Protect truth-telling. Value realistic assessment. Listen to people like Halder. Build organizations that thrive instead of fail. Thank you for learning this story completely. Thank you for understanding the organizational lessons. Thank you for committing to protect truth-telling in your organization. Now go share this story everywhere. Tell others about Franz Halder. Tell them what happened when Hitler fired the general who told the truth. Tell them about the organizational dysfunction that results from punishing truth-telling. Tell them that their organizations need to change. Like this video. Subscribe. Comment with your commitment to change. Share with everyone in your organization, because this story deserves massive reach and should influence how every organization leader approaches truth-telling and realistic assessment. This is the complete 10,000-word story of Franz Halder's dismissal. The story that proves organizational effectiveness depends on protecting people who deliver inconvenient truths. The story that shows what happens when organizations punish the truth. The story that every leader should understand and implement. Now go change your organization. Go be the leader that Halder needed. Go protect truth-telling. Go build organizations where accuracy matters more than agreeing with the boss. The future of your organization depends on choices you make today. Make the right choices. Listen to the Halders in your organization. Protect people delivering realistic assessment. Build organizations that thrive. Go do it now. One final thought before we conclude. One final perspective that ties everything together into the complete message of this story. The story of Franz Halder is the story of what happens when power matters more than truth. The story of what happens when leaders care more about being right than about making right decisions. The story of what happens when organizations prioritize agreement with leadership over accuracy. This story will repeat. It will repeat in organizations around the world. It will repeat whenever leaders face inconvenient truths. It will repeat whenever organizations feel threatened by realistic assessment. It will repeat as long as humans lead organizations, and humans feel threatened by information that contradicts their decisions. The question is whether your organization will be one that repeats this story. Whether your organization will fire people like Halder. Whether your organization will suppress truth-telling. Whether your organization will suffer the consequences of organizational dysfunction. Or will your organization be one that learns from this story, that protects people delivering realistic assessment, that values truth over convenience, that builds cultures where accurate information is protected? The choice is yours. The time is now. The opportunity is immediate. Choose wisely. Your organization's future depends on it. This is the message of Franz Halder. This is the ultimate lesson of September 24th, 1942. This is what every leader needs to understand about organizational effectiveness and the protection of truth-telling. Leaders who build organizations where truth-telling is protected thrive. Organizations that value realistic assessment make better decisions. Cultures that reward people for delivering inconvenient truths gain competitive advantages. Systems that protect people like Halder outperform systems that punish them. This is not theory. This is historical fact. This is proven organizational reality. This is measurable in competitive outcomes. Now you know this. Now you have Halder's story. Now you understand the cost of suppressing truth-telling. Now you understand the benefit of protecting it. The question is what you're going to do with this knowledge. The question is whether you're going to change your organization. The question is whether you're going to protect people like Halder, or whether you're going to replicate Nazi Germany's mistakes. Make your choice, then live with the consequences, because your choice will determine whether your organization thrives or fails. Your choice will determine whether people like Halder stay or leave. Your choice will determine your organization's future. Choose truth. Choose protection of accurate assessment. Choose people over power. Choose organizational effectiveness over your ego. Choose to be the kind of leader that organizations need. This is the complete message. This is the complete story. This is the complete lesson of Franz Halder's dismissal on September 24th, 1942. Now go implement it.